Ray Hollis signed her name with a cheap blue Bic pen, the scratching sound the only noise in a room suffocated by arrogance. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackwell, Sloan, and Pierce law firm, a bitter November wind whipped through the steel canyons of Manhattan. The sky was the color of old pewter, promising a hard winter, but inside the climate-controlled office, the air was still and smelled faintly of lemon polish and aggressive cologne. Grant sat across the mahogany expanse, draped in a bespoke Italian suit that likely cost more than the college tuition of the paralegal standing nervously in the corner. He tapped his fingers on the table, a rhythmic, impatient sound. Beside him, his lawyer, a man with a face that seemed permanently creased into a condescending smile, pushed the thick stack of documents a fraction of an inch closer to Ray. "It is a generous settlement, Mrs. Mercer," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and heavy like molasses. He lingered on her married name as if it were a loan he was graciously allowing her to keep for a few more minutes. "Grant wants to be fair. We hope you appreciate the charity involved here, considering the circumstances." Ray didn't look at the numbers. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what they were, scraps. It was an offer designed not to settle a marriage, but to provoke a fight. Grant was watching her closely, his pale blue eyes sharp and hungry. He was waiting for the performance. He wanted the tears. He wanted the raised voice. He wanted the stereotype of the angry black woman that he could later recount to his friends at the country club over single malt scotch to justify his betrayal. He wanted her to scream so he could remain the calm, rational victim of an incompatible union. But Ray just adjusted the collar of her camel wool coat. It was simple, well-made, and entirely hers. She picked up the pen again. Her hand did not tremble. There was no hesitation in her posture, only a spine as straight as a suspension bridge cable. She slashed her signature across the bottom line, not as Mrs. Grant Mercer, but in bold, looping script, Ray Hollis. A quiet murmur rippled from the back of the room where the junior associate stood. "Calm for a black woman," someone whispered. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy, a tired prejudice slipping out like dust. Ray heard it. She let it drift past her like smoke. She capped the pen and set it down with a soft, deliberate click that sounded louder than a shout in the expectant silence. "Is that it?" Grant asked, his confident smile faltering just a fraction. The script in his head wasn't playing out. "No fight for the beach house? No begging for the portfolio? I expected you to be more emotional about this, Ray." Ray stood up, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. She looked at the man she had spent 10 years supporting, the man whose books she had balanced in the dark while he basked in the spotlight. "I don't fight for things that don't belong to me, Grant," she said, her voice low and even, possessing the timbre of a late-night radio host who knew the secrets of the city. "And I certainly don't fight for things that are broken." Grant scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair, regaining his composure with a practiced ease. "Well, good luck, Ray. I hope you find someone suitable for your new station in life." He meant it as a final insult, a reminder that without him, without his name and his money, she was invisible in this city. Ray didn't offer a handshake. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't even acknowledge the lawyer who was now shuffling the papers with awkward haste. She simply turned toward the heavy glass doors. She walked out of the conference room without turning back, leaving Grant surrounded by the glow of his own vanity and something colder he couldn't name. Ray returned to her Tribeca apartment, a white box of clean lines where she finally exhaled the breath she seemed to have been holding for years. The silence here wasn't oppressive like the law firm. It was welcoming, a sanctuary she had bought with her own earnings before the marriage, a fact Grant had always conveniently forgotten. She touched the button on her vintage stereo, and the melancholic, smoky notes of Miles Davis filled the room, washing away the memory of the lawyer's patronizing drone. She moved to the kitchenette and brewed a cup of chamomile tea, watching the steam rise against the dark windowpane that overlooked the city lights. She was just lifting the mug when her phone buzzed on the marble counter. The screen flashed Martha Miller. Ray frowned. Martha was her old neighbor from Queens, a retired schoolteacher who sent handwritten Christmas cards and baked oatmeal cookies that tasted like childhood. She shouldn't be calling this late. "Ray." Martha's voice was thin, cracking under the weight of panic. "I didn't know who else to call. The letter came today. The Zenith Fund, they say it's frozen. That was my surgery money, Ray. That was my entire nest egg. Ray gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles paling. She could hear the terror of a woman who had played by the rules her whole life, only to have the rug pulled out from under her in her twilight years. "Listen to me, Martha," Ray said, her voice dropping into a soothing, ironclad register. "You are not going to lose that money. Do you hear me? Trust me. I am going to make it right." She ended the call, but she didn't sit down to cry. She sat down to work. She placed her tea on a coaster and woke her workstation. 3 monitors flared to life, casting a cool blue glow over her face. In this light, the calm wife vanished. The architect emerged. She retrieved a small, encrypted drive she had copied months ago, a backup Grant had carelessly left in a pile of junk tech, because he never bothered to understand the hardware, only the checks. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Columns of data cascaded down the screens. She bypassed Grant's rudimentary security with insulting ease, peeling back the layers of the Zenith Fund. It was exactly as she suspected. A classic Ponzi structure, paying old investors with new money, bleeding dry the accounts of people like Martha to fund Grant's Italian suits. But then, her eyes caught a folder Grant had archived under dead weight. She opened it. Helios Tech Grant had acquired the small startup for its real estate and planned to liquidate its research division. Ray opened the schematics. She saw test results for a solid-state battery that didn't overheat, a stable energy density that engineers had been chasing for a decade. Grant saw a line item that wasn't turning a quick profit. Ray saw the future of the energy industry. He had buried a diamond because he was too busy chasing pennies. A cold, sharp smile touched her lips for the first time that day. She opened a secure channel to draft an email to her old team, Jax and Tia. She didn't just have the evidence of his crime. She held the key to his salvation, and he didn't even know he owned it. Numbers didn't lie, people did, and Ray had just found the erosion line that would bring Grant's castle of sand crashing down. Ray drafted her first official email as CEO of Hollis Quant, the subject line reading simply, "Independent Audit Request." 6 months had passed since that freezing afternoon in the law firm. The gray slush of a New York winter had given way to the pale green buds of spring, and finally, the humid warmth of early May. While Grant had spent those months chasing headlines and spending money he didn't actually have, Ray had been building in the quiet. The silence Grant had mocked was not emptiness. It was an incubation. She hit send, the soft click echoing in her office, now bustling with the hum of servers and the low murmurs of Jax and Tia. But the most important conversation happened a moment later. Ray opened a secure video link. The screen resolved into the image of Cassius Rose, a man whose face appeared on Forbes covers, but whose voice was rarely heard by the public. He was sitting in a sunlit study, the ocean visible behind him. "Ray Hollis," Cassius said, his voice deep and rumbling, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "I've reviewed the Helios files you sent. The density metrics are impossible, unless they are true." "They are true, Cassius," Ray replied, leaning back in her chair, a mug of herbal tea steaming beside her hand. "Grant bought the company for the land rights. He doesn't know what's in the lab. He's going to bankrupt Zenith by the end of the quarter, and he'll take that technology down with him unless we intervene." Cassius studied her for a long moment. "And what is your price, Ray?" "Everyone has one." "I don't want a payout," Ray said, her gaze steady. "I want the company. I want to save the pension funds he pilfered, and I want Helios operational. I want balance." Cassius nodded slowly, a spark of genuine respect lighting his eyes. "My jet is at Teterboro. The Grand Prix is this weekend. Let's introduce Miami to the real CEO of Hollis Quant." Across town, the atmosphere was far less strategic. Grant Mercer stood before a full-length mirror in his penthouse, critical of the fit of his linen suit. He was preparing for Miami, the crown jewel of his social calendar. He envisioned champagne on the deck, photographers snapping his picture, the envy of his peers. He was reaching for his platinum card to pay the tailor who had come to him when his phone buzzed. A notification from his private bank. Transaction declined. Account frozen, compliance check. Grant frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Glitch," he muttered, waving the tailor away. He dialed his banker's private line. It rang, and rang. Then a click. Not a human voice, but a recording. Please be advised that all accounts associated with Zenith Holdings are currently under review by the SEC. Please hold for a federal representative. Grant lowered the phone slowly. The room was perfectly temperature-controlled, yet he suddenly felt a line of cold sweat trickle down his spine. He looked at his reflection. The expensive suit, the manicured hair, the veneer of untouchable success. It all looked thin. Paper thin. He tried to log into the main corporate dashboard. Access denied. He tried his backup offshore accounts. Access denied. The silence in the penthouse was no longer luxurious. It was suffocating. He wasn't just locked out of his money. He was being corralled. For the first time in his carefully curated life, Grant Mercer felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: fear. The headlines spread faster than the evidence itself, wrapping their racism in soft wording like knives hidden in velvet. Financial blogs and news tickers were buzzing with the revelation of the audit, but the language used to describe the mysterious firm behind it was telling. They called Ray a surprise player, a former wife stumbling onto success, or hinted that she must be a figurehead for a more experienced, read white and male, partner. They couldn't conceive that the architect of Grant's undoing was the quiet woman who used to stand in his shadow. In Midtown Manhattan, Grant Mercer was far removed from the digital chatter. He was standing in a pawn shop that smelled of dust and desperation, a place he had passed 1,000 times in his limousine but never imagined entering. The air conditioning was broken, and sweat began to stain the collar of his linen suit. He placed his Patek Philippe Nautilus, the one he had bought to celebrate his first million, onto the scratched glass counter. "Cash," Grant demanded, his voice tight. "And I need it now." The clerk, a man with heavy eyelids who had seen kings become paupers before, didn't even blink. He examined the watch with a loupe, indifferent to Grant's agitation. "5,000, he grunted. "It's worth 50, Grant snapped, his facade cracking. "Not today, it ain't," the clerk replied, sliding the watch back. "Take it or leave it." Grant took it. He had no choice. With a wad of bills in his pocket, humiliatingly small for a man of his ego, he bought a one-way ticket to Miami. He convinced himself that once he reached Cassius Rose, once he charmed the board, this nightmare would end. He just needed to be in the room. The arrival in Miami painted a study in contrasts. Ray touched down on a private tarmac, greeted by the humid embrace of the Florida heat and a waiting car sent by Cassius. She wore oversized sunglasses and moved with a serene grace, ignoring the paparazzi shouting questions about her lucky break. She didn't need to answer them. Her answer was in the portfolio resting on her lap. An hour later, Grant landed commercial. He marched to the rental car counter, flashing his platinum smile. "Convertible. Red." He handed over his card. The agent swiped it. A pause. She swiped it again. "I'm sorry, sir." "Declined." "Try it again," Grant hissed, conscious of the line forming behind him. "It's declined, sir." "Do you have another card?" He didn't. He had $5,000 in cash and a crumbling empire. Humiliated, Grant walked out into the suffocating midday heat and hailed a cab. The vehicle was old, the suspension shot, and the driver smelled of stale tobacco. As the cab lurched into the gridlock of traffic heading toward the marina, Grant pulled out his phone. The signal was spotty, but a new article loaded. Hollis Quant, the firm exposing the Zenith fraud. He stared at the name. Hollis. It wasn't just a random corporate title. It was her middle name. The name she used on her library card. The name of the woman he had underestimated every single day of their marriage. The realization hit him harder than the heat. As he rode in the back of a smelling cab, a single thought pulsed in his skull: she did this. But the truth was harsher. He had built his empire on lies. Ray had simply struck the match. Ray stepped onto the deck of Cassius Rose's mega yacht, the Meridian, looking like she had built the vessel herself. She wore a suit of crisp white linen that deflected the Miami sun, standing in stark defiance to the heat that seemed to be melting everything else on the marina. The air smelled of salt water and expensive champagne, carrying the low hum of deals being struck by the world's elite. Grant Mercer arrived 10 minutes later, but he did not look like he belonged. His once pristine suit was wrinkled from the cramped taxi ride, and dark patches of sweat stained his collar. He shoved past a distracted security guard, banking on the fading currency of his face recognition, and stumbled onto the teak deck. His eyes scanned the crowd frantically until they landed on Cassius Rose. But Cassius wasn't looking at him. He was listening intently to the woman standing beside him, the woman holding a crystal glass of iced tea with the poise of a queen. "Ray." Grant's voice cracked across the deck, raw and desperate, shattering the polite murmur of the party. "You think you can just walk in here? After everything I gave you?" He lunged forward, panting heavily. The guests fell silent, turning to watch the spectacle. Grant pointed a shaking finger at her, his face flushed with a dangerous mix of humiliation and rage. "She's nobody," he shouted to the crowd, trying to rally them to his side. "She's just my bitter ex-wife. She doesn't know the first thing about finance. She was a housekeeper with a calculator." Ray didn't flinch. She didn't even set down her glass. She turned to him slowly, her expression unreadable, devoid of the anger he so desperately wanted to provoke. It was Cassius who spoke first. The billionaire stepped between them, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Be careful, Grant," Cassius warned. "You are speaking to the majority shareholder of Helios Technologies." Grant froze. The name hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "Helios," he stammered. That junk startup? "I own that." "You own the land," Ray corrected him, her voice cutting through the heat, cool and precise. "You ignored the patent. You ignored the solid-state battery tech sitting in the archives because you didn't bother to read the engineering reports. You threw it away. I picked it up." She took a step closer, looking not at his face, but through it. "You were so busy building a fraud, Grant, that you threw away the only real thing you ever had." The realization hit Grant with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just lost his money. He had been outsmarted by the very person he had dismissed for a decade. His face twisted. The shame was too much. He lunged at her, a guttural scream tearing from his throat, hands reaching for the woman who dared to be greater than him. He never reached her. Two large security officers intercepted him mid-stride, pinning his arms back with practiced efficiency. Grant struggled, shouting obscenities, stripping away the last shreds of his dignity. Ray watched him with a look of profound pity. "My silence was never submission, Grant," she said softly, though in the hush of the deck, everyone heard it. It was a verdict. Grant was dragged off the pier screaming, while Ray turned her back to the noise, facing the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise over her new empire. The chaos of the arrest faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the yacht strategy room where the real work of repair began. While the guests outside were still gossiping about the spectacle of Grant Mercer being hauled away in cuffs, Ray sat at the head of a polished walnut table. Across from her sat the trembling remnants of the Zenith board, men who had happily looked the other way while Grant cooked the books, but who now looked to Ray as their only lifeboat in a storm of litigation. "We are not liquidating," Ray announced, her voice calm but leaving no room for debate. She placed a single file on the table, the plans for Helios. "This technology is the future of clean energy. It is the patient. The fraud was the cancer. We have cut out the cancer. Now we save the patient." One of the board members wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "But the investors, the pension funds, the lawsuits will bury us, Ms. Hollis." "Hollis Capital is acquiring the assets," Ray corrected him gently. "And the first order of business is restitution." She slid a tablet forward. On the screen was a list of names, hundreds of them. Ordinary people. Teachers, firefighters, retirees. At the top of the list was Martha Miller. Ray tapped the screen, authorizing the transfer from her own acquisition fund to a new escrow account labeled Victim Restoration. It was a massive sum, enough to buy another yacht, but Ray didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and sent a short text to Martha. "Your pension is safe. Go bake some cookies." A moment later, a reply popped up, a row of crying face emojis and a simple "thank you, Angel." Ray smiled, and for the first time, the tightness in her chest truly uncoiled. Grant had used money to build a wall between himself and the world. Ray was using it to build a bridge. An hour later, she stepped off the yacht to face the press. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden fire across the water. The reporters surged forward, microphones thrust in her face. The narrative was already shifting. They were hungry for the story of the scorned wife who toppled a king. Ms. Hollis, a reporter from a major financial network, shouted. Grant Mercer was considered a visionary. People are saying you must have been the secret behind his success all these years. His silent partner, his muse. Is that true? Were you his muse? Ray paused. She looked at the cameras, her expression serene, stripping away the last layers of the calm wife persona the world had forced onto her. She adjusted the microphone, ensuring her voice would be heard clearly in every living room across America. I wasn't the muse, she said, her voice steady and resonant. I was the author. She didn't wait for the follow-up questions. She turned and walked toward the waiting car, leaving the flashbulbs popping behind her like distant fireworks. She didn't need their validation. She had her truth. Ray Hollis had reclaimed her name, and in doing so, she reminded the world that dignity creates a sound that echoes longer than any shout. Ray's journey reminds us that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest, and that true dignity never needs to shout to be heard. When we choose to look past the surface and lead with integrity, we don't just build wealth. We build a legacy that lifts everyone around us. So today, take a moment to honor your own quiet strength and remember that, like Ray, you are the author of your own story. If this message resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own worth.